Muy buenos días a todos a todas y todos los presentes. El Consejo Nacional de Educación le da la más cordial bienvenida a la 20ª versión de su Seminario Internacional titulado Financiamiento de la Educación Superior, un debate en desarrollo. Queremos pedirles, por favor, a todos los presentes que apaguen o pongan en silencio sus teléfonos móviles para no interrumpir el normal desarrollo de este encuentro. Muchas gracias. Queremos saludar a las autoridades que hoy nos acompañan. En primer lugar, está con nosotros el presidente del Consejo Nacional de Educación, el señor Pedro Montt. También están los consejeros del Consejo Nacional de Educación. Se encuentra con nosotros el jefe de la División de Educación Superior del Ministerio de Educación, don Francisco Martínez. También saludamos a los rectores de las instituciones de educación superior que nos acompañan. Queremos entregar un saludo especial al invitado internacional, el señor Bruce Johnstone, y a todos los panelistas nacionales que participan en el día de hoy. También saludamos a los representantes de organismos gubernamentales, a los académicos y a los investigadores que nos acompañan en esta mañana. Y por supuesto darle la bienvenida a todas y todos ustedes que están con nosotros en este Hotel Crown Plaza. El Consejo Nacional de Educación tiene por rol cautelar y promover la calidad de la educación a través de la evaluación de diversas propuestas educacionales de organismos públicos e instituciones de educación y la entrega oportuna de información a estudiantes, académicos y a la comunidad en general. Para introducir el tema que nos convoca el día de hoy, queremos presentar un video sobre el quehacer de la institución.
El Consejo Nacional de Educación es un organismo autónomo creado en abril de 2012. Su misión es promover y cautelar la calidad de la educación chilena en todos sus niveles, en el marco de los sistemas de aseguramiento de la calidad de la educación escolar y superior. Está conformado por 10 miembros, un académico de reconocida trayectoria que cumple las funciones de presidente, 2 profesionales de la educación que ejercen labores docentes en el ámbito municipal y particular, 4 académicos de reconocido prestigio propuestos por el presidente de la República y ratificados por el Senado, un miembro designado por el Consejo de Rectores, otro por las universidades privadas autónomas acreditadas y un tercero designado por los institutos profesionales y los centros de formación técnica acreditados. Su conformación plural y diversa le permite abordar con visión de sistema y conocimientos técnicos las materias sometidas a su consideración. Su quehacer involucra juicios técnicos que requieren ser adoptados con independencia de otros órganos del Estado. En los procesos evaluativos recurre a consultores externos y a la opinión de actores relevantes del sistema educacional para la toma de decisiones. El Consejo Nacional de Educación integra el Sistema de Aseguramiento de la Calidad de la Educación. En el ámbito escolar, la administración del sistema corresponde al Ministerio de Educación, al Consejo, a la Agencia de Calidad y a la Superintendencia de Educación. Al CNED le corresponde aprobar o informar los instrumentos curriculares y de evaluación de la educación escolar presentados por el Ministerio o la Agencia. En educación superior, el Sistema Nacional de Aseguramiento de la Calidad es integrado por el Ministerio de Educación, el Consejo y la Comisión Nacional de Acreditación. Las funciones son información, licenciamiento y acreditación. Al CNED le corresponde el licenciamiento de las nuevas instituciones de educación superior privadas. Es la instancia de apelación de algunas decisiones adoptadas por la CNA y apoya al Ministerio de Educación en las decisiones de cierre de instituciones de educación superior. El Consejo Nacional de Educación aporta al sistema educacional a través de posicionamientos sobre temas en el ámbito de la educación. Asimismo, participa en redes internacionales de colaboración y actualmente cuenta con el sello de calidad de la red INCUAGE como un organismo adscrito a buenas prácticas en aseguramiento de la calidad. En el ámbito de la investigación e información pública, el CNED sustenta bases de datos, estadísticas y provee información del sistema. Promueve y facilita el análisis y el desarrollo de investigación sobre la educación escolar y superior y fomenta la reflexión sobre diversas temáticas de educación. A partir de las últimas iniciativas legislativas de la Reforma Educacional, el Consejo asumió nuevas funciones, tanto las referidas a la ley que crea el administrador provisional y de cierre, como a la ley de inclusión escolar. El Consejo ha puesto a los estudiantes en el centro de su quehacer, con el objetivo de velar por sus aprendizajes y logros. Su desafío es avanzar hacia una noción compartida de calidad en educación, con estándares y criterios reconocidos, procesos participativos y de continua revisión, con el propósito de fortalecer la educación nacional en todos sus niveles y modalidades, con una visión de Estado a través de la evaluación y la mejora continua de la calidad.
Luego de este video, y para dar una bienvenida más formal a este encuentro, queremos invitar a dirigirse a los presentes al presidente del Consejo Nacional de Educación, don Pedro Montt.
Soy un poco pequeño, así que ahí, para poderlos ver bien. Bueno, espero estar a la altura de las promesas que hace el Consejo en su video, como me decían, de propaganda. Señor jefe de la División de Educación Superior del Ministerio de Educación, consejeros del Consejo Nacional, estimados rectores que participan en este evento, un especial saludo a Bruce, tuvimos el placer de estar conversando con él el día de ayer, por su disposición y generosidad, ha tenido muchas reuniones de trabajo, y a todos los participantes en el seminario, bienvenidos. A nombre del Consejo quisiera llamar la atención sobre un tema que cuando lo pensamos algo de picardía pusimos, porque suponíamos que a esta altura del año iba a ser un tema extremadamente contingente. Y buscamos a uno de los mejores expertos a nuestro juicio a nivel mundial para aproximarnos a esta compleja y difícil tarea de cómo financiar adecuadamente, con equidad y con calidad, a la educación superior. En esa línea, el Consejo desea realizar un aporte a la agenda educacional y a las políticas públicas del país, abriendo un debate y un espacio de reflexión y discusión en torno a aspectos que deberán ser abordados para avanzar hacia un sistema de financiamiento de la educación terciaria y además eliminar barreras económicas de acceso, ese es uno de los pasos, pero también sortear otras barreras como las de permanencia y egreso de los estudiantes de la educación superior, considerando políticas de inclusión. En las últimas décadas, el sistema de educación superior de Chile ha presentado un gran crecimiento en términos de matrículas y alternativas académicas. Hoy contamos con un sistema complejo y diverso. Más de 1.100.000 estudiantes se encuentran matriculados este año en programas de pregrado de 159 instituciones de educación superior. La cobertura bruta en el último quinquenio subió 12 puntos porcentuales, alcanzando un 60% el año 2014. Nos encontramos, somos el país de América Latina que más expansión las últimas décadas ha tenido en materia de oferta y de oportunidades a los estudiantes de educación superior, y por lo menos en estas dimensiones hemos llegado a poder ser comparados con países de alto desarrollo. Sin embargo, el aumento en cobertura no ha sido equitativo y la participación en el sistema de los estudiantes provenientes de las familias con menores ingresos es baja. En términos netos no alcanza, se mueve en un guarismo entre el 20 y el 30%, los 3 primeros quintiles. Enfrentamos así el desafío de avanzar hacia un sistema de educación superior equitativo, inclusivo y, por supuesto, de calidad. Para mejorar la equidad en la educación superior se requieren mecanismos que garanticen no solo el acceso, como decía, sino la permanencia y el egreso de los estudiantes con mérito provenientes particularmente de las familias de más bajos ingresos. Nos encontramos en un escenario de reforma de la educación superior, el cual busca fortalecer el marco regulatorio, promover la calidad de las instituciones de educación superior, revisar la institucionalidad del sistema y cambiar los mecanismos de financiamiento. Es una reforma integral de vasto alcance. El Consejo Nacional considera que dichos cambios deben realizarse teniendo como eje prioritario a los estudiantes y el desarrollo de los conocimientos, valores y habilidades que les permitan ser un aporte en el ámbito laboral y profesional y contribuir de manera integral a la sociedad. También ser buenos ciudadanos. La gratuidad, tema en el cual se ha centrado la discusión en el último tiempo, requiere ser complementada con mecanismos que permitan mejorar las oportunidades de acceso y permanencia y titulación para garantizar la participación de los estudiantes de los sectores más vulnerables. Dichos mecanismos se relacionan con medidas de acompañamiento, iniciativas orientadas a compatibilizar trabajo y estudio, entre otros. Crecientemente se incorporan a la matrícula de educación superior estudiantes sobre 25 años y esa es una variable que es tendencial, que va a tender a incrementarse. Es importante considerar el punto de llegada de las políticas públicas en desarrollo y los mecanismos y procedimientos de implementación que deben evitar el riesgo de generar comportamientos y resultados no deseados de diversa índole, como por ejemplo inconsistencias entre las necesidades, la pertinencia de alternativas académicas y sus beneficios para la sociedad, el desincentivo a la progresión académica, el desincentivo a la eficiencia y de la gestión institucional y las dificultades de proyectar el desarrollo institucional, entre otros. Existen distintos mecanismos de transferencia de recursos por parte del Estado a las instituciones de educación superior y actualmente se discute el cálculo de aranceles regulados. Sabemos que el cálculo de los costos de la educación superior es una tarea muy compleja. Ello porque las instituciones realizan diversas actividades vinculadas entre sí, como la docencia, investigación y vinculación con el medio, con claras externalidades y sinergia, donde la docencia o investigación en una disciplina utiliza el apoyo de otras. Respecto a la determinación de aranceles que se requieren para el costo de la docencia, la dificultad radica en establecer los costos de transferencia entre las actividades de las instituciones de educación superior y la cuantificación de todos los componentes de las funciones propias de la educación superior, como ya comentaba. En este seminario, y este seminario es una invitación a conocer tendencias internacionales en financiamiento de la educación superior, pero a la vez con la participación de académicos y expertos nacionales quisiéramos poner el foco en aquellos aspectos que complementan las medidas tendientes a avanzar en acceso y que contribuyan a la calidad de nuestro sistema educativo. Van a estar con nosotros prestigiosos académicos comentando los temas de financiamiento de la educación superior más allá de los contingentes de la gratuidad. De esta manera buscamos vincular a las instituciones, generar instancias de colaboración e intercambio de experiencia, reconociendo que muchos de los problemas que se enfrentan son comunes y por lo tanto las soluciones pueden ser encontradas y enriquecidas por todos quienes participan en el sistema. Finalmente, quisiera agradecer nuevamente a los invitados por aceptar el desafío de participar en este seminario, especialmente al doctor Bruce Johnstone, Rector Emérito de la Universidad Estatal de Nueva York y Profesor Emérito de la Universidad Estatal de Nueva York en Buffalo, destacado especialista en el tema del financiamiento de la educación superior. Posteriormente saludaremos a todos los rectores y académicos que van a participar en el foro. También les agradecemos su asistencia. Muchas gracias.
Agradecemos las palabras del presidente del Consejo Nacional de Educación, don Pedro Montt. A continuación queremos invitar a dirigirse a los presentes, a quien representa la ministra de Educación, Adriana del Piano, el jefe de la División de Educación Superior del Ministerio de Educación, don Francisco Martínez.
Bueno, en primer lugar, un saludo amistoso, cariñoso a todos ustedes y agradecer al consejo, la visión que tuvieron de pensar de que en esta época íbamos a estar en una interesante discusión, con suficiente antelación. Es una capacidad de predicción notable, pero se agradece porque efectivamente es necesario contar con espacios de discusión. Un saludo al profesor Johnstone que nos acompaña. Muchas gracias por traernos su visión y compartirla con tanta capacidad de poder ir mostrarnos qué está pasando en el mundo, básicamente. Y un saludo de la ministra especial. Lamentó no poder estar acá hasta altas horas de la tarde, sino de la noche. Ella iba a estar aquí, pero cambió la situación. Así que me vi en la obligación de preparar algo en las últimas horas de la madrugada, pero así es la vida. En todo caso, no es un tema que me pille demasiado de sorpresa, como ustedes se imaginarán. Y yo quisiera comentar que básicamente nuestra tarea está orientada hacia concebir un sistema dentro de la complejidad que tiene, que se haga cargo de algunas dificultades que hemos enfrentado. Chile, desde los años 80, optó por un modelo, y usar la palabra modelo en este caso es bien apropiado, porque efectivamente es un modelo en el sentido de que lo aplicó de una manera bastante amplia y sin mayores connotaciones o modificaciones de lo que podría entenderse como el modelo. Y ese modelo significaba, en esencia, liberar el mundo de la educación, de transformarlo en una especie de mercado con mayor participación, buscando un objetivo que en aquella época se planteaba como necesario, que era ampliar la cobertura, mejorar la calidad y dar un mejor sistema de educación al país. Por alguna razón, la experiencia llevó a que los resultados que entregó este sistema efectivamente cumplió algunos de los objetivos. Entre ellos, el más repetido y el más conocido, es la cobertura. Amplió notablemente la cobertura en educación superior. Y si fuera eso suficiente, estaríamos contentos y tratando de demostrarle al mundo que ese es el camino. Sin embargo, al poco andar dejó una dificultad, un colapso, diría yo, desde el punto de vista social. El colapso proviene de que hay algunas cosas que no se cumplen, no se logran y no se logran superar. Y el sistema hace difícil que evolucione a solucionar esos problemas naturalmente. Y uso la palabra difícil porque de hecho no lo pudo hacer dentro de sus propias reglas. Y finalmente fue una discusión muy fuerte respecto de cómo debería entonces enfrentarse a esta situación. ¿Qué significa eso? Que la capacidad de evolución no fue generada endógenamente por el sistema. ¿Qué problemas tenía? En primer lugar, tiene un problema, cabe mencionárselo a todos los que nos miran en este proceso, tarea que muy bien hace el profesor Johnstone por lo demás, de ir mirando el mundo, las diferentes experiencias, que efectivamente logró cobertura, pero en el tema de calidad dejó dificultades difíciles de superar. Aparentemente, el sistema requería que no hubiera legislación que obligara a controles de calidad y sistemáticamente mantuvo abierta la voluntariedad de la acreditación. Se insistió en que eso tenía que evolucionar porque no daba garantías, pero no funcionaba con el tema de mantener la cobertura y dejar libertad de acción. Es una primera contradicción que generó el modelo y que nos llevó a sistemas en los cuales incluso el Estado tuvo que intervenir. Acción que estaba totalmente vedada para el Estado y hace un año atrás pasó una ley para poder resolver problemas críticos. El sistema permanentemente está cerrando instituciones, pero había casos emblemáticos en los cuales miles de estudiantes quedaban sin poder estudiar. Ese es un problema que la única solución que se encontró fue intervenir en alguna instancia del sistema. porque la lógica empresarial que dominaba algunas de las instituciones no se hacía cargo de esta sustentabilidad de esas instituciones en el mediano plazo. Otro problema es que la calidad es muy heterogénea, por la misma razón de la falta de control. Y por lo tanto los estudiantes, y la razón, y muchos se preguntan, ¿por qué entonces eso no se resuelve endógenamente? Si las universidades o las instituciones de educación superior no ofrecen calidad, ¿por qué los estudiantes siguen entrando? Entonces, ¿cuál es la respuesta que el sistema da a esa pregunta? Interesante tema de investigación, yo no voy a lucubrar sobre ese tema, pero el hecho está. Los estudiantes siguen ingresando a instituciones independientes de que sepan de que su calidad no está garantizada. ¿Y cómo lo hacen? Lo hacen endeudándose, proyectando a largo plazo una visión que tratan de predecir de qué va a ser beneficiosa para ellos. En muchos casos lo es, y efectivamente hay estadísticas que son interesantes, pero no nos hacemos cargo de un montón de casos en los cuales no lo es. Esa situación tiene connotaciones sociales importantes porque los estudiantes ingresan, se matriculan, hacen el esfuerzo, se endeudan y al poco andar abandonan y quedan con deuda sin título. Y cuando hacen el esfuerzo de llegar al título, hay casos en los cuales encontramos que esos títulos los estudiantes se dan cuenta que no tienen trabajo o que no son valorados. Entonces, hay algo ahí que no funciona. Dejo para los investigadores por qué no funciona y den las explicaciones correspondientes. Respecto de la equidad, el sistema efectivamente tiene instituciones de muy buena calidad, estamos orgullosos de hartas de ellas, nunca estamos suficientemente contentos, no se trata de ser de quedarse en los laureles, como decimos nosotros, respecto al tema de la calidad. La calidad es una permanente obsesión en la educación superior, es una necesidad para el país también. Pero también tenemos instituciones que no tienen suficiente calidad como para garantizar que eso aporte, los profesionales puedan aportar en su labor a la sociedad. Y después, en el tema de la equidad, el problema es que los estudiantes son segregados. Los estudiantes de las buenas instituciones atraen a los mejores estudiantes. Y los mejores estudiantes están correlacionados socioeconómicamente. Eso es un dato que podemos verificar una y otra vez, solo para llegar a reproducir el mismo fenómeno año tras año sin poder encontrar una buena solución. Esa segregación no es justa y la sociedad reclama por eso. ¿Cómo lo solucionamos? Es otra de las tareas que se ha planteado. El segundo eje de nuestro trabajo, después de calidad, es equidad. Tenemos que encontrar un modelo que logre ofrecer y garantizar mayor equidad en el acceso. Y la equidad en el acceso falla en dos componentes. Primero, académica, porque los estudiantes de menores ingresos tienen menos condiciones académicas para poder competir con otros estudiantes en la carrera para llegar a las mejores instituciones. Podemos echarle la culpa a los niveles inferiores de educación y siempre podemos estar desde la educación superior diciendo, mire, hay un problema en los cursos, en la educación media, en la educación básica. Y eso parece ser bien estructural, porque si uno mira lo que pasa en muchos países que tienen modelos similares, pasa exactamente lo mismo, independiente de que también lo hagan en los diferentes niveles de educación. Parece ser un problema más profundo que solamente permanentemente estar tratando de corregir, que tenemos que hacerlo, y lo estamos haciendo, la educación, enseñanza escolar. Razón por la cual entre las modificaciones que tenemos que ver es cómo hacemos efectivamente mayor inclusión, independiente de que hay condiciones siempre que atentan contra eso y que son de carácter bastante sistémico. Pero tenemos que ver cómo encontramos una manera de mejorar la inclusión. Y la inclusión tiene dos caras. Primero tiene la cara de la justicia social. El Estado de todos aporta recursos para las instituciones y todos deberían tener la misma condición de acceso. Un tema de justicia social. Pero tiene otra cara. Tiene una cara productiva, de la productividad del país. Si no logra atraer los talentos que están distribuidos en la población, sino que atrae a aquellos que han tenido mejores oportunidades, perdemos talento. Y estamos haciendo un mal trabajo. No estamos produciendo lo mejor para nuestro país y para las próximas generaciones. Y ahí podemos explicar, a lo mejor, en parte, la razón por la cual no logramos superar nuestras restricciones en producción, en innovación. A lo mejor tenemos un sesgo de incapacidad de innovar por el hecho de que tenemos demasiado segregado y no tenemos, por lo tanto, participación de todos. Y el tercer componente de nuestra propuesta tiene que ver con pertinencia. La verdad es que si miramos las críticas que nosotros mismos hemos hecho, todos nosotros creo, compartimos respecto de lo que ha producido el sistema, es que no logra ofrecer condiciones de pertinencia que sean de común acuerdo, como por ejemplo, que ciertas carreras que se requieren no se desarrollan. No hay mercado, no hay estudiantes, no hay carreras. Otras carreras que sí tienen mercado se sobredesarrollan, hay sobreoferta. Y por años, ¿qué hacemos? Tenemos que mirar para el lado suponiendo que eso se va a resolver. ¿Cuántos años toma eso? Hartos años, bastante frustración y sobre todo pérdida de recursos. ¿Cómo es posible que este país todavía no desarrolle una capacidad en tecnología minera de la mejor del mundo? Si el sistema, tal como lo hemos concebido hasta ahora, funcionara, deberíamos haber superado eso como la primera tarea obvia, porque tenemos las condiciones. Bueno, eso no ocurre. No ocurre naturalmente como esperábamos que ocurriera. Algo hay que hacer. Mirar para el lado sobre estas cosas y decir esto se va a solucionar en algún momento, lo hemos hecho. Hemos apostado a eso. Y sin embargo, la dinámica del sistema no responde adecuadamente en muchas de estas razones. Debemos entonces decir que el mercado nos falló. Quizás mi pensamiento es que a lo mejor el mercado le estamos pidiendo demasiado. En un sistema tan complejo como este, donde el mercado reacciona a la información que tiene disponible y le cuesta mucho predecir a largo plazo, a lo mejor le estamos pidiendo demasiado. Y por lo tanto enfrentamos una discusión bastante profunda de que este instrumento, que sirve en muchísimas áreas para dejar que el sistema evolucione y se desarrolle y logra tener bastante éxito, en la educación resulta complicado asumir, al menos a ese nivel, las ventajas que puede tener la desregulación, un sistema desregulado basado en las condiciones de mercado. Nosotros ya hemos avanzado en establecer un cambio al sistema. Estamos desarrollando una propuesta que venimos discutiendo con muchos de ustedes por lo demás desde hace tiempo. Hemos elegido participación. Nosotros no hemos presentado todavía ningún proyecto, el gobierno no ha presentado ningún proyecto al Congreso, lo hará. Pero todo este periodo ha sido de amplia discusión, de debate. Y en ese proceso hemos ido revisando y ajustando de acuerdo a las discusiones que se han ido dando. Eso ha sido difícil porque genera, por un lado, exceso de expectativa, por otro lado, la participación no siempre da lugar a dar en el gusto a todas las visiones, es imposible, pero sin embargo pensamos que es la manera de hacerlo. Primero, porque es un sistema complejo donde incluso la comparación internacional ayuda, pero no resuelve claramente el problema. Y segundo, porque es una connotación natural asociada a nuestra visión de que la sociedad tiene que participar en los debates. En ese proceso estamos y esperamos llegar al Congreso con un documento que haya sido participativo, que tenga amplias visiones. Esperamos poder ofrecer un sistema que es mixto. Es un sistema mixto y por lo tanto es más complejo. El modelo europeo, que es fundamentalmente estatal, se mueve hacia condiciones de mercado en algunas variables, sin duda, pero es totalmente estatal y regulado. No es nuestro modelo porque no tenemos un sistema totalmente estatal. Siempre ha sido mixto. El sistema privado, como tal, tampoco es un modelo cuando la sociedad tiene una componente pública, estatal, y por lo tanto, si es que la deja vivir en el mundo de la competencia privada, transforma esas instituciones en un ente más privado, razón por la cual empiezan los desequilibrios entre las expectativas de lo que tiene que hacer una institución estatal y lo que realmente hace cuando está liberada al mercado. Concebir un sistema entonces que cumpla sus misiones en las diferentes facetas, en este sistema tan complejo, es la tarea. Yo les quiero dejar entonces estos comentarios a modo de reflexión durante lo que sigue de este panel, agradeciendo a todos los que organizaron esta reunión, agradeciendo el entusiasmo y la decisión de poder seguir debatiendo. Seguro que no va a terminar aquí en esta reunión, pero algo iremos avanzando, agradeciendo a todos los presentes y, de todas maneras, insistir o rehacer el saludo de la ministra a todos ustedes. Muchas gracias.
Agradecemos al jefe de la División de Educación Superior del Ministerio de Educación, don Francisco Martínez. Antes de dar inicio a las conferencias, quisiera mencionar que en las bolsas que les entregaron en la acreditación hay un papel para que ustedes puedan hacer preguntas, comentarios, consultas a las conferencias o cuando se desarrollen los paneles. Solo bastará que ustedes levanten la mano mientras se desarrollan el panel o la conferencia y algún miembro de la organización les tomará ese papel para el posterior debate y moderación de cada encuentro. Dicho esto, damos paso a nuestra conferencia internacional. Ya lo hemos dicho, el encargado de esta conferencia es Rector Emérito de la Universidad Estatal de Nueva York y Profesor Emérito de la Universidad Estatal de Nueva York en Buffalo. Para presentarnos el tema Reforma al Sistema de Financiamiento de la Educación Superior, Tendencias Mundiales, dejamos con ustedes al doctor D. Bruce Johnstone.
Well, thank you very much. It is truly an honor to be, for my first visit to Chile. I regret that, but I will be back again. It's a beautiful city. To the President and members of the National Council, to the ministry officials, I thank you for that very clear, albeit complicated, exposition of what the ministry is struggling with. It is a special honor to be able to be here, in part knowing the issues that are before you right now, and to perhaps play some small role in helping as all of you are grappling with the dilemmas of worldwide financing of higher education. Part of what I can say to you is that in your dilemmas, in your struggles to reconcile the soaring cost of higher education with the insufficiency of revenues and with the dilemmas of access and participation, you are not alone. And that's a message that I will attempt to bring to you. Again, I appreciate the introduction. I come to you with a variety of backgrounds. One of my backgrounds is as a scholar of higher education, finance, and governance, and also my management experience as rector or president of a reasonably large undergraduate college, and then as the president of the State University of New York system, which itself has more than 400,000 students, and depending upon how you count the institutions, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 different campuses, including community colleges, medical centers, research universities, and four-year colleges of technology. So I combine all of this during the years at the University at Buffalo as a professor of higher and comparative education. I was fortunate enough to be able to have a long-standing and well-funded by the foundation project that I termed the International Comparative Higher Education Finance and Accessibility Project. And this was an examination of the worldwide shift of cost from being in so many countries predominantly or sometimes even exclusively supported by the state, by which I really mean the citizen taxpayers of the state, to being shared by parents and students as supplemental revenue source. So in most of my work in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe, I have been bringing messages of how to supplement insufficient state revenue with tuition fees and other forms of cost sharing. One of the fascinations of this trip is this is the first country I've been to where it is more of a retreat from cost sharing and an effort to reduce, apparently, the dependence upon the supplemental revenue from parents and students. And I understand the politics of this. Politics and ideology is a reality, as is the fundamental underlying finances. And so we're contending with two realities. In my discussion today, I want to focus on finance, but also acknowledging that access and quality are very much related to finance. In fact, access and quality really emerge from successful finance. I'm giving you worldwide trends, mainly in the industrialized world, of which, without question, Chile is a member by its membership in the OECD, the advanced industrialized countries of the world. Chile belongs within this body of industrialized country. I will concentrate on matters of importance to Chile, but I bring you more a sense of what other countries have been doing, and will be a little bit reticent to say, here's what you should do. I'm not sure what you should do, but I am sure where you are in connection with many other countries. I do know something about features of Chilean higher education. I know the sudden expansion of institutions and enrollments. I've been dealing with this particularly in African and Asian countries where the underlying enrollments are surging at an incredible rate, driven by demographics, increasing birth rates, increasing population cohorts, and further driven by the expanding percentages of these expanding cohorts completing secondary school and aspiring to higher education. It is true that the public support of state and private higher education together is a feature of Chile. In some respects, it's a feature of all of Latin America and much of East Asia. So the reliance on public institutions, state-supported or not state-supported, is a feature that has been increasingly evident in virtually all of higher education. Large private, both nonprofit and for-profit sectors of higher education. And the relatively low level of state tax support in Chile, which in a sense is a sign of hopefulness. Many other countries, I have been despairing of additional public tax revenues for the support of higher education, in part because of the great competition from other politically and socially compelling demands, whether these other demands are elementary and secondary education, public health, infrastructure needs, social welfare needs, pension needs. Higher education is always in competition with all of these other needs. But the fact that your state support, tax support, is on the low side relative to other advanced industrialized countries gives some hope for some slight solution there. You've also got an established system of student grants and loans, more recently income contingent or income sensitive loans, and all of this, I think, is important. Somehow I'm not. Do I need help here? Point it this way. Okay, very good. Is it moving now? I apologize for my occasional technical insufficiency.
Sorry.
Okay. All right, and I'm aware of the issue of whether tuition fees, which are high in Chile, can be substantially lessened or even eliminated at some institutions, and from where would come the revenue to replace the family stream of revenue, or would it be replaced? And if not replaced, what is the effect on institutions, institutional quality, the austerity that naturally comes to institutions from the loss of a revenue source, and perhaps the effect on accessibility and participation, which, as we heard from the ministry, is an enormous and proper priority of this government. So this is an underlying question that I well understand. What I want to do today is to recite a couple of problems, criticisms of higher education, followed by a context that I will call a context of troublesome facts, and I will present them as facts. I think they are virtually unarguable, and they form a context for higher education finance worldwide. I want to summarize with the financial dilemma as I see it, again, worldwide. I want to talk about some possible solutions to the financial dilemma on the cost side, or the ability to reduce cost or become more efficient or productive, and then solutions on the revenue side. How can revenues, additional revenues, help solve the problems? Finally, tuition and loans, some critical questions that I will go very quickly through, ending in a summary of worldwide trends and then a bit of a summary on where I see the dilemma for Chile. Let me turn then to what I call, a few more critical questions. The overemphasis on research and scholarly prestige, the insufficient attention to teaching, particularly to the instructional needs of the less well prepared, too little regard for students and their employability. This is a worldwide issue. It's a worldwide issue exacerbated by or increased by the number of students graduating from universities in, say, China, Korea, India, Philippines, Indonesia, countries where I've recently been examining, far exceeding the creation of new jobs. And so you have the perplexing dilemma of unemployed graduates. Graduates who at one time expected that employment would naturally follow their completion, but it no longer does naturally. And that's another worldwide dilemma. The dilemma of failure rates, dropout rates, and persistence, particularly among those who are lower socioeconomic status, and to institutions, complaints of over-regulation and the insufficient balance between the autonomy that they want and they think they can allocate resources better than the government can tell them how to do it, and the frustration over simply the insufficient revenues from the state, and then the students complaining understandably worldwide about tuition fees being high and being in the way of access and persistence, and increasingly throughout a world that relies on student debt, on unmanageable debt. Sometimes people look upon, for example, the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland. Isn't it wonderful that there is no tuition fee in the Nordic countries? Well, I guess for students, in some respects, it is wonderful, although there is also no officially expected parental contribution to the cost of student living. So the Swedish student graduates from the university with very high debt levels because of the high cost of living. Does that different than graduating with debt levels because of a moderate tuition fee? Probably not. So in looking at the sharing of cost, part of it is the cost of instruction, but part of it also is the cost of student living, even for a country like Chile, where most of the students, especially in their undergraduate years, continue to be living with their parents. There are costs involved, whether there are transportation costs, food and living costs. So this is part of the dilemma throughout. The troublesome facts. Fact number one, higher education is expensive and more troublesome than the high cost of instruction is the annual trajectory of increasing cost, driven by the fact that we are a sector of employment that tends to be resistant to productivity, resistant to the substitution of high labor cost or the substitution of machines and technology for high labor costs. So the underlying kind of natural trajectory of underlying cost really tracks the wage and salary costs in higher education, which tend to be somewhat in excess of the rate of inflation. And then this, in so many countries, Chile including, but especially middle and low-income countries with surging enrollments that I mentioned a moment ago, these per-student costs are magnified by the soaring enrollment needs. And this is the trajectory of sharply rising cost and revenue needs, followed then by limited growth in available revenue, whether that limitation is attributable to slowdown in the economy, whether it's attributable to tax resistance, whether it is attributable to competition from other compelling needs, as I said before, elementary, secondary education, healthcare cost, pension cost, public infrastructure, all of these compete. So the underlying dilemma, as it were, is what I call the virtually universal divergence of sharply rising cost and less rising available revenue, leaving a gap that either has to be filled with some alternative revenue source or somehow solved on the cost or productivity side. The other fact is the tendency of higher education, in spite of the fact that we all want it to be a player, a participant in increasing equality or reducing inequality. The fact is that higher education tends to perpetuate and even accentuate, increase inequality. And by that I mean that the students from parents who are themselves university educated, who have had good schools, oftentimes private schools, who have the good fortune of peers who are similarly advantaged by their parents, tend to do very well in higher education. They have the study skills. Students who come out of poverty, often isolated rural backgrounds in my country, disadvantaged minority families, often single-parent families, often from inferior secondary schools, reach the age of 16, 17, 18 without the accumulated knowledge, without the study skills, without the aspiration, without the incentives, and a few of the very bright ones will make it. But we almost always must remember that the average and below average student, and by the way, I always remind people that on any given measure, whether it's height or weight or intelligence, half of all of you are below average and half are above average. That's what an average is. It's in the middle. I don't worry about the above average for the most part. I worry greatly about the below average, particularly when they're also financially disadvantaged, and they've reached the age of 17 or 18. They may be high school dropouts. They may be high school graduates with insufficient language and mathematics skills. Here is what the problem is, and that is a worldwide phenomenon. Number 4 is this preoccupation with costly research and prestige, again, worldwide, combined with an insufficient attention, either a social attention or a resource attention to the more accessible, shorter cycle colleges or community colleges, 2, 3, 4 year. And this, again, is a worldwide problem. The political and ideological resistance to regular, insufficient, and sustainable tuition fees. This may surprise you, probably doesn't. That I mention this as a phenomenon. It becomes a problem when the tuition fee stream of revenue is part of the institution's budget and revenue, and when that tuition fees are frozen and can't increase as costs increase, then either the government must make up the missing revenue or the institution must cut some budgets. And when I was president or rector of a college for 9 years, when I was the president or head of the university system for another 6 years, almost every year I was contending with insufficient government revenue and the inability to compensate for that by increasing tuition fees. So I was cutting and cutting and cutting. How do you cut? Well, you don't replace faculty who leave. You replace faculty, regular faculty, with part-time faculty, adjunct faculty. Some of them are very good, but they tend not to have the dedication to either their instruction or the scholarship that we expect. The 6th troublesome fact is that student financial assistance is technically difficult. Means testing, we call it, which is the method by which a government evaluates the parents' or family's ability to afford a tuition fee, is very difficult. You can ask students, you can ask families how much they make. Depending upon the answer that they want to give, it's difficult to verify what that is. And if grants are available only to low SES students, which they are in Chile, in virtually all countries, then how do you know what students are? Most advanced industrialized countries have tax systems and ways of verifying wage income and asset income. Developing countries generally do not. So it's a very difficult technical issue. The technical issue of student loans. There are between 90 and 100 student loan programs throughout the world. Most of them, if the purpose of a student loan is to provide a third government tax, parents, and then a third stream of revenue, albeit over time, most of these 90 to 100 student loan programs in the world fail. That is, they produce very little revenue over time. A technical problem. 7, economic changes are throughout the industrialized world, reducing the employment opportunities for those who are without post-secondary education. You all know about that. But on the other hand, the ability of economies, I mentioned this before, to absorb all of the graduates with high knowledge content jobs is also tricky. China, for example, is graduating, We have about 23, 24 million students, higher education students in China. They're graduating about 4 million additional students every year. The Chinese economy is a fairly successful economy, although it's been slowing recently. But the Chinese economy does not create 4 million brand new high knowledge content jobs every year. So even in China, as in Korea and in Japan and in Russia and in Africa and in Egypt where I've seen it, the phenomenon of the unemployed graduate becomes a problem and a fact. This persistence of high failure rates and non-completion rates that are correlated with low income or ethnic or linguistic marginality. This is not a major phenomenon in Chile. In many countries, my own included, it is. My city of Buffalo, which has now only about 300,000 inhabitants, the high school teachers there contend with nearly 80 different languages, in addition to poverty and single family and other aspects of low income and poverty. And that's a worldwide phenomenon, whether it's ethnicity or second languages. The persistence and access rate always is in part a function of that. And then there's this political and social ambivalence about what to do. My summary, in a sense, is that the problems are, number one, this institutional and system austerity that flows from the diverging trajectories of cost and revenue needs and available revenues. Virtually all countries are suffering from that. Secondly is the widening gap between the institutions that are lucky. They're lucky because they have endowments, because they have strong reputations, which they deserve and they have earned, because they have an affluent pool of applications, and other institutions. And there's nothing wrong with having a variety of institutions and both their academic and their financial fortunes differing. The point I'm making here is that it's a widening difference in most countries, and I think it is in Chile. The slowness of college and universities to change, particularly to adapt to new technology. Everyone knows that instructional television or e-learning or massive open online courses, called MOOCs, at least in English, can, in theory, provide much cheaper education. Does it work? And it works at some levels. It works maybe for advanced professional education, maybe adult education, but it's not been replacing the cost and the instructional methods of undergraduates anywhere in the world successfully. And the politicization of campuses where tuition fees, institutional fortunes get tied up in politics. Politics is a reality, but it complicates the problems. Increasing numbers of unemployed graduates, I mentioned the persistence and the widening gap between those who are financially well off and academically well prepared and those who are not. These are what I call troublesome facts. Now, looking at finance, I'm back to this diverging trajectory. There are cost side solutions, which I'll go through very quickly. You can, many countries, including
virtually all of the Latin American countries and East Asian countries, Philippines, Korea, Japan, India, have solved part of their problems by turning to tuition fee supported private universities, either nonprofit or for-profit, but the line between what's nonprofit and for-profit, as I think you've learned in Chile, is a difficult, kind of a fuzzy line of difference. So one is relying on private fee-supported tuitions. One is by limiting, say, as in Brazil, the number of costly public research universities to an increasingly elite and competitive students, and relying on, again, private institutions or even lower cost public institutions for all the rest. A third, of course, a favorite of faculty and students and politicians, is to reduce costs by cutting administration. Who needs administration? Get along without it. Fewer counselors, fewer pro-rectors, vice-rectors, assistant rectors, associate rectors, advisors, and all of this. Is it true? Well, maybe. I would submit that most of what we call by the metaphor the low-hanging fruit has already been picked in reducing administrative cost, although in the United States there is pressure to reduce the cost of public relations, the cost of marketing, and especially the cost of intercollegiate athletics, which does not worry you, I think, in Chile, but it's a huge cost in America, particularly American football and basketball. How else do you cut costs? You cut costs through mergers, but most of them fail. Most mergers, if they work, really are the closure of one of the two institutions being merged. You can create economy from changing the university as a state agency to a public corporation, meaning greater autonomy. Autonomy of the rector and the deans to reallocate the resources in a proper way. This is a worldwide trend, particularly in America and in Europe, where, although some don't like the term, we often use the term corporatization, meaning changing a public university or college from a state agency like a department to a public corporation still owned by the government, with a governing board appointed by the government, but yet with the ability to admit its own students, to execute contracts, to hire and dismiss, if necessary, faculty and staff, to sue and be sued in courts of law, to issue debt. This is what a public corporation can do, which is generally thought to be more economically efficient than an agency. Technology, I've already mentioned that, self-paced student learning tends to be expensive and often not working. So having pushed the cost side solutions to this diverging trajectory, we looked then at revenue side solutions, such as what we all hope for, restoring state tax support. That's what we all want. Certainly in my country we want it, European countries want it. My sense is that for a variety of reasons, including the competing demands for, again, elementary, secondary education, welfare, pensions, infrastructure, the likelihood of solving the diverging cost dilemma by restoring large and continuing state tax grants is unlikely. In most countries. So maybe we can shift from the taxpayer to parents and students tuition fees. This is what has been done throughout most of the world for the last, say, 15 or more years. I've seen it happen in Russia, in China, former communist world. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Seeking outside revenue through entrepreneurship, through specialized fee-supported courses, whether it's in English or specialized master's programs. This is entrepreneurship, and a number of your universities I know have done this. Public-private partnerships. The problem, if it is a problem, is these tend to divert the faculty from their instruction. And whereas it can solve a financial problem through a new stream of revenue, it is itself somewhat costly and can be diverging. Philanthropy. This is a favorite of American universities. A handful of Chilean universities has successfully sought philanthropy. For the most part, the rest of the world looks upon the American example with great envy, but almost unreplicable. That is where alumni, graduates are simply expected to donate every year. The first year, maybe it's a $25 or $50 donation. It probably costs more to collect that than it does to really help. But eventually, big donations, $1,000, $10,000, $100,000, $1 million, winding up with a Harvard University, as you may know, with something between the 30 and 35 billion, that's with a B, $1 billion endowment that generates hundreds of millions of dollars every year forever. This is what endowment does. But it takes a long period of time and a culture and a governmental tax treatment of partial subsidization. I recognize you have some of that in Chile. Perhaps it can be increasingly important, but it is a revenue side. The forms of cost sharing, of course, we all think of tuition fees, but that's only one. Many African countries and former communist countries, the Russia and the other 14 republics emerging from the Soviet Union, where much of the cost used to be the provision of housing and food and lodging to students, has been to privatize this stream. Even more important than tuition fees. In Morocco, in US, in England, part of the cost sharing effectively has been freezing the grants, which are eroded over time as inflation reduces their real value, or shifting from grants to loans, which presumably provide more accessibility for the dollar or the peso than do grants. Or diverting more students, again, into the tuition-dependent private sector. These are all forms of cost sharing that has been used to solve, in part, this diverging revenue gap between costs, revenue needs, and available state revenue. There are many kinds of tuition fees. I don't want to spend a lot of time with this, but I'll tell a story about England, or actually about Scotland, which happened in 1998. The UK was the first European country to adopt a real tuition fee. It was small by US or by Chilean standards. I think it was £1,000, $2,000 or $3,000 at the most, probably less than that. And this was, of course, greatly disliked by the students. It was adopted by a labor government, that is the somewhat left or center-left government. By 2006, the opposition to the tuition fees, I'm back to Scotland. I was told in 1998 that Scotland had abolished tuition fees. And I wondered about this, and I said, where is the missing money coming from? Here are great universities, Edinburgh, Glasgow, that used to rely in part on a stream of tuition fees. It's gone now. What's happened? Are English taxpayers now subsidizing, making up for the missing revenue? And so I asked my friends in the United Kingdom, and I was told, well, Bruce, a little more complicated than this. They didn't really abolish tuition fees. They abolished upfront tuition fees. The tuition fees largely paid by parents to enter the university. And they replaced this by deferred tuition fees, which were paid by students after they graduated. All right. In 2006, England did the same thing. And they abolished what by that time was a more substantial tuition fee and moved it from an upfront fee largely paid by parents to a deferred fee with interest. Sounds like a loan, but in England you didn't call it a loan. Student didn't like that term, loan. Deferred fee, okay. Is it a real loan? Well, it's an income contingent loan. That's not a real loan. It was an income contingent interest-bearing loan, which meant that many students would pay for a long time, but it wasn't quite the same as a regular loan, or so the students thought. Winners and losers? Yes. The winners, of course, were the middle and upper middle income parents who were paying the tuition, upfront tuition fee that no longer had to pay it. It was now deferred. It was the students' problem. The losers were the children of low-income parents who, because the upfront tuition fee was means-tested, that is, not charged to low-income families, were now paying for what their parents never had to pay, and they were the losers. Now, I say all this really to emphasize the complexity, the oftentimes unintended consequences which you're about to face in Chile of substantially moving around this sharing and shifting of the burden of higher education cost between taxpayers, parents, and students, when the underlying cost of instruction is pretty much the same. It's a kind of, we used to call it zero-sum game, that if the taxpayers are paying less, then parents will pay more, or the institutions suffer continuing budget cuts because of this diverging trajectory. So this has been happening around the world. There are also the dual track tuition fee. This is what was invented really by Russia and the former communist countries, where free education was a constitutional right that probably couldn't be changed. And yet the Russian economy, as you may remember 20 years ago, had almost collapsed, and there was no money. There was no money to pay faculty salaries. There was no money to pay for the housing and the lodging. So what do? You have to have free education for universities. Well, you did that by redefining who is entitled to the free education. And you defined it by saying higher education will be free to regular students. Who is a regular student? Well, a regular student was a student who passed an entrance examination at a high enough score that could be adjusted each year by the government to yield only the number of students the government could afford to support. Anyone else that had qualifications could get in by paying very high, essentially full cost fees. So what the result was, of course, is that students, not totally unlike situation I mentioned before, including Chile, students who had the advantage of university-educated parents, private secondary education, peers that were university-oriented, they passed the examination, got a free higher education. Other students that were close but not quite had to pay. A handful of the very bright, very poor could pass the exam, but the rest of the very poor had no luck. And this was throughout the former communist world. It was adopted in East Africa. The famous Makerere University in Uganda, where the dilemma of these diverging costs and revenue needs was terrible, solved the problem the Russian-Soviet way by adopting the dual-track tuition, such that in Russia some 50% of university revenue, it turns out, was from tuition fees. In Makerere University in Uganda, 80% of the students were in the fee-paying track, although they continued to be able to say, technically, higher education is free. So that's some of the tricks that have been played on the tuition fee. I want to go a little bit faster here. The advantages of tuition fees are that it can be regular and sustaining, particularly once it gets to be used to and ceases to be a political issue. It doesn't divert faculty from their core instructional interests. It is supported by economic theory, if you want that. Equity, particularly since most taxes are relatively regressive or paid for by everybody. We like to think the rich pay much, much, much higher taxes. Most countries, they all pretend that's the case. In point of fact, the very wealthy have all sorts of ways of avoiding taxes, lessening taxes. And taxes tend to be paid for by the average consumer via gasoline taxes, utility taxes, sales taxes, all of this. And when you have a case where the free higher education is tax supported, then some economists will say it's the average taxpayer and the poor who are subsidizing the children of the wealthy in the high-cost public universities. It's thought to be more efficient because by students and parents having to pay something, perhaps they'll take the education more seriously. Here's a question in Austria. Austria became the first German-speaking country to adopt a tuition fee. They adopted it by a conservative government in the summertime when the universities were shut down. And of course it was terribly resisted, angered the students and the political left, understandably. And then enrollments went down. And the students said, see, our poor brethren cannot afford this tuition fee. I think it was something like 500 euros or something. It wasn't huge, but it was a new expense. And enrollments went down. After about 3 years, it was studied to see who left, who dropped out. Turns out that the dropouts were overwhelmingly students who, in the old European German system, weren't really students. They would register, they wouldn't go to class. By registering, they were students and they had free transportation, and they had the advantages of being a student, but there were no required course examinations. And to them, these students, an extra 500 or 800 euros a year was no longer worth it. So they dropped out. It flushed out the non-students. What do I conclude from this? There's been a great deal of research on price elasticity. What is the effect of adopting a tuition fee or increasing a tuition fee on access and completion? And these are important. This is the important question. What's basically been found in US and Europe through the research has been that higher education is, for the most part, very price inelastic. That is, the additional tuition, particularly once it gets used to, and is like all other prices that rise over time, doesn't have an effect. At the enrollment margin, those students who are from poor families, where an additional 500 euros or $500 is tough to get, there are no deeper pockets, the aunt or the grandparents can't pick it up, they're already employed part-time. Here's where you have a problem. But it's a fairly narrow band of students defined by the student who are marginal and often ambivalent. They may not be doing it well anyway. Price goes up. I don't want to pay. I don't want to play anymore. I'd rather go out and get a job. And these are the students. Does that matter? Yes, it matters. But it's a relatively narrow range by the research in US and Europe that is affected. Now, let me, I don't want to go into student loans. I think that's too complicated. I have a lot of opinions about income contingency. I think it tends to be oversold. The income-sensitive repayment is a good idea. It makes the loan repayment more manageable. What I get bothered by is when it is sold as policy as not a real loan, because it is a real loan. And most students will repay at interest, albeit those students with low lifetime earnings get a subsidy, which I think they deserve, and I like that idea. Summary, worldwide trends. First of all is a reform of budgeting. This is more transparent budgeting, a budget which is given recognizing enrollment trends, but recognizing other things as well. Perhaps program cost differences, perhaps successful completion rates. The problem with rewarding successful completion tends again to reward the universities that enroll from the start the most academically advantaged students. So if you want to reward by your government grant those kinds of students, you effectively punish those institutions whose mission is to reach out and expand accessibility, knowing that there is a risk that those students may not complete. So building things like completion rates, persistence, into your formulas for budgeting can have unintended consequences, and it's difficult. Greater acceptance of cost sharing, again, pretty much everywhere except Chile and Norway. But when you have only 5 million population and all that North Sea oil, and you're the richest country per capita in the world, I guess they can afford it. Most countries can't. More widespread use of student loans. Again, hopefully more successful cost recovery. This is a worldwide trend. A greater use of what I call income sensitive. This can either be income contingent loans or regular loans that have a kind of an income contingent option if the borrower in repayment becomes unemployed or takes a very low-paying job, then income contingency enters in. If they become employed again, then they will revert to a regular repayment loan. And then public sector diversification, a major trend, worldwide trend, which in some respects, Chile is there, except where the sector diversification serves two things. It serves to provide a, for the most part, lower cost education because it's shorter cycle and because the faculty are not expected to do research and scholarship and therefore tend to teach higher loads, a larger student-faculty ratio, dampening the cost of instruction in the shorter cycle. The other thing it provides is a more accessible, lower enrollment expectations, taking a chance on students. Where it really works in the United States is where there is what I call sideways or horizontal mobility. So a student can start at a lower cost and low tuition fee, very accessible community college that takes all high school graduates, has really no other requirements other than a high school diploma. And if they do well after a year or 2 years, they can move sideways into the university, taking all their credits with them. If they don't do well or if they aren't interested, they continue with a short cycle, they learn a trade, a profession, and that's fine too. So what most short cycle institutions don't have yet is this sideways mobility, and yet you're seeing it in France, in the Institut Universitaire Technologie, being able to move into the university. You're seeing it in the German Fachhochschulen, being able to move into the university. In the Dutch, I can't pronounce the word, it's this long, HBOs, moving sideways. So this is a trend that is happening, maintaining sector diversification, which is lower cost and more accessible, but which is not a blind alley that once entered cannot go into the university sector. on a growth of private sector, which clearly Chile needs no introduction. But the growth of the private sector is enormous, and it's happening in Africa, in China, in Russia. Most of it is low quality. A lot of it is for-profit, low quality. It takes an active quality assurance accreditation to maintain the quality. Okay, Chile. Where do I see Chile within these worldwide trends? Well, I think the autonomy, which is sort of like public corporation, the practice of essentially giving block grants without a lot of regulations attached and allowing rectors and deans to reallocate and use the money as they see best. Chile has been pretty good. The reliance on private funds and tuition fees certainly has been in very much accord with worldwide trends. The use of student loans and income-sensitive repayments, Chile has that. I don't think you've had your income contingent loan program long enough to see if it works. And when I say it works, is there a robust repayment stream measured in, to the economist, a present discounted value of those repayments or not? I don't think you know. I know you don't know. I hope it does. But the interest rate is very low. And so even if everybody repays, it won't really recover the present value of what was given out in the beginning. And all of the leakages or defaults will further reduce that. There was a wonderful paper done by a colleague of mine named Adrian Zeiderman, who is an Israeli economist, looking at student loans in many, many countries with this in mind. What is the subsidized grant component, which is the stream of interest subsidies embedded in the highly subsidized low-interest loans compared to the cost of administering a loan program. And what he found was that more than a few countries, the government would save money by giving the students the grant, not bothering to try and collect it, because the collection was at such a low interest rate and so many losses from defaults and forgiveness that it didn't pay for the cost of administering a loan program. This is the difficulty in student loans. Sector diversification, again, Chile, in a sense, looks very good. What it lacks is that horizontal, sideways mobility where the vocational centers and the institutes can be used as an entree for some very successful students into universities. And certainly a robust private sector, including for-profit. In this case, Chile is, I would say, certainly was quite within the worldwide trends. I think this is my last slide. Issues. Certainly the quality assurance in the nonprofit sector is one. Quality assurance is difficult because in a sense it's contrary to autonomy. And what is needed, and this is a very difficult balance in all countries, is a balance between autonomy and essentially trust in rectors, deans, and even faculty to use resources, particularly tax resources, well, and by well, I mean cost effectively and with regard to students, and trust in their judgment with the need to assure quality and to have criteria and standards. And they essentially compete in all countries. And I think Chile is looking for a new balance. All I say is be careful, because over-regulation can be not only itself costly, but in a sense remove the trust and judgment from the rectors and the deans. Secondly is the need to have a value to the student loan repayments. This means probably a more realistic rate of interest and a great deal of attention to the collection of the loans, even when they're income contingent. Third is the need to selectively build some top universities. Clearly, Chile has several top universities, but Chile, in its economy, its stature within the Western Hemisphere, arguably should have more universities with international reputations, measured not only by world rankings, which have lots of flaws in them, but measured by your ability to attract students, particularly throughout the Spanish-speaking world. You want to come to Chile to do your undergraduate as well as your graduate and advanced professional work. I think that's an area that Chile needs to work on, which is a matter of quality and reputation. Need to restore more tax support. And then a need to prioritize how that state tax support will be used. And this is a kind of an indirect way of getting at my last slide, which is my last slide. It's gone. My last slide is that, okay, you want to get rid of tuition revenue from some universities, all universities, which universities? What is the effect on access and persistence and quality? If the removal of gratuity, of the tuition fee requirement, is restricted, obviously, to the most selective universities, then a little bit like England, the winners will be upper middle class parents who will be happy, and they may shower their happiness on the politicians, but it won't really change accessibility, and it will cost a lot of money. Where will the money come from? I'm not sure. It may come from the institution saving more cost. It may come from more tax revenue. But if there is more tax revenue, if you were that lucky, then is that the best use of the tax revenue, as opposed to greater public ownership and support of the short cycle institutions that are receiving most of the low-income students that the government seems to care appropriately greatly about. Reducing those tuition fees, increasing the grants. There are lots of things to spend money on, perhaps other than tuition fee relief to parents of the more elite universities. I will end my presentation there. I hope it's been useful. I was suggested to be somewhat provocative, although, again, I understand the dilemma. Politics and ideology is a reality along with underlying finance. These are two realities. And I say, good luck. in your reconciliation of the problem.
Gracias al doctor Bruce Johnstone porque nos ha traído esta presentación. Y vamos a invitar a quien va a moderar la parte de preguntas y comentarios, el rector de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Valparaíso, el señor Claudio Elortegui. Bienvenido.
Buenos días. En primer lugar, quiero felicitar por su tan interesante y provocativa exposición sobre las tendencias internacionales en educación superior y las implicancias, ¿no es cierto?, las lecciones que nos pueden brindar. La organización del seminario especifica que vamos a tener una primera ronda de preguntas de en torno a unos 10-15 minutos para posteriormente pasar a un break y después del panel vamos a tener una nueva ronda de preguntas hacia el profesor Johnstone. Así que entiendo que se había ofrecido para hacer preguntas a través de preguntas escritas, ¿no es cierto?
Si alguien tiene algún comentario, alguna pregunta, puede levantar la mano para retirar el papel. En la audiencia no veo yo a nadie. Rector, por favor, algún comentario del que acabamos de ver como moderador.
Sí, a ver, mientras se generan otras preguntas, me gustaría preguntarle, en realidad se generan hay muchas preguntas que formularle sobre esta exposición. Una primera pregunta sería, el profesor planteó en su intervención esta característica en muchos países de la heterogeneidad, de la calidad en las instituciones de educación superior. ¿Hasta qué punto esa heterogeneidad es una característica que atraviesa los distintos países o es podríamos decir, un mal atributo de los sistemas de educación superior? ¿Hasta qué punto es algo, podríamos decir, inevitable, ¿no es cierto? ¿O es una tendencia a corregir, ¿no es cierto?, y a minimizar como uno de los objetivos de la política pública? No sé si se entendió la pregunta. ¿No la escuchó? Did you hear the question?
He's repeating it. I tend to think that higher education quality tends to be an issue more on what I would call, again, the margins of institutions. I hate to say it because there are a number of representatives of nonprofit and for-profit short-cycle institutions, and I know a number of friends in the United States who are running for-profit institutions, and they're high quality. But I've seen too many that are low quality and that are essentially both a waste of the governmental money, which comes from the portable grants and loans, and also dangerous to the consumers. And the consumers tend to be the students, the least sophisticated, least prepared students who are often seduced into a short cycle training program which proves in the end to be unable to place them in a job, and they're left only with a debt. And this is a problem. For public universities and private established for-profit universities, I tend to think that quality is not a worldwide problem.
Gracias. Tenemos una pregunta de don Gonzalo Guzmán de la Universidad Andrés Bello. ¿Considera usted importante la diversidad de proyectos en la calidad y desarrollo de la educación superior?
The diversity of projects. If I understand the question, I think as difficult as it is for a ministry and for the National Council, it's very difficult to attack these problems one by one and start one and solve it and then go to two. You almost got to have simultaneous attention to tuition fees, to financial assistance, to grants, to loans, to quality assurance. I think it's inevitably difficult, but I don't fault the ministry from trying to move forward on multiple fronts, although I think it makes the task much more complicated and difficult and opens the door for what I called unintended consequences.
Aquí tenemos otra pregunta. Se le solicita, por favor, profundizar a qué se refiere en su exposición con este concepto de mayor autonomía para las universidades públicas desde state agencies a public corporations.
Yes. A state agency, in a state agency, you tend to have faculty and staff as governmental employees, civil service employees, rather than employees of the institution. You tend to have the inability to execute a contract without going through all the state requirements for contractual obligation. You tend to be unable to borrow money, even if borrowing money makes great sense. Sometimes borrowing money for a hospital or for an addition or in our country for a dormitory is perfectly reasonable and can be repaid by the income flow that comes from that. All of that requires a public corporation which can execute contracts, borrow money, sue and be sued without obligating the state. And the protection is that the governing board of the public corporation is itself appointed by government, but it's a little bit removed, so it stands between the government and the Congress or Parliament in all of its politics, and the institution, in a sense, represents the institution's needs to government, but also represents the people's needs to the institution. So these public corporation governing boards, I think, are one of the features of American public higher education that is most precious and is being copied elsewhere in the world.
Una pregunta de don Fernando Vial. Cuando las instituciones fijan sus aranceles, puede ocurrir que una parte de ellos consideren subsidios cruzados entre programas, como también subsidios hacia la investigación, lo que incrementaría el pago y eventualmente la deuda del estudiante al aumentar de esa forma los aranceles. ¿Cuál es la experiencia que existe para controlar esto que puede ser un problema?
Yeah, a very good question. Cross-subsidy does exist. It exists to some degree between programs. Certain programs are costly programs, particularly laboratory sciences and engineering with intensive equipment needs tend to be expensive. Other programs, much in the humanities, social science, tend to be much lower cost. And probably some cross-subsidization is inevitable. It's justified in part by saying that a true university has to have, to be a true university, a diversity of programs. And cross-subsidization is simply part of the cost. But when you consider a tuition fee in a public university, certainly in the United States, my universities, the tuition fee still at most covers maybe 30 or 40% of the underlying cost. So even if the student of humanities is paying only the same tuition fee as the student of biophysics with higher cost, it isn't really a cross-subsidization because fundamentally the state taxpayer is recovering that difference, and what the humanities student gets is the prestige that comes from his or her university being able to say it has a strong program in science and engineering, even if he or she is not in fact in those programs.
Muchas gracias. Vamos entonces ahora a pasar a un café, los invitamos, break con café, y posteriormente retomamos el seminario con la segunda parte, el panel de expertos y una segunda ronda de preguntas, incluyendo al profesor Johnstone, a quien le reiteramos nuestros agradecimientos por tan magnífica exposición.
Tenemos solo 15 minutos por el café, por favor. 15 minutos, gracias.
Those crazy nights I do remember in my youth. I do recall those were the best times.